It can certainly be said in much longer and more complex form, but for the sake of brevity, the most simple statement of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism could be this. The first, all of life is suffering. The second, suffering is caused by desire or attachment. The third is that you can escape suffering by giving up desire. And the fourth is that the way to give up desire, the life that allows you to be free of attachment and desire, is by following the Eightfold Path. Now, stated in that way could lead you to believe that religion is, at least Buddhism, is about avoidance of suffering, that the greatest good in life is simply to not suffer. The Christian religion, ironically, seems to start at the other end of the spectrum, the earliest of the Gospels being basically an apologetic for martyrdom, praising people that are willing to die in painful and tortured circumstances, such that the crucifix becomes a primary symbol of the Christian faith. And much of early hymns and poetry and art is devoted to the anguished suffering of Christ. Now, I have to credit the psychiatrist Scott Peck with this idea, since he evidently published it a long time before I thought of it. But Christians often think too little about the joy of the Christian faith, and Buddhists tend to think too little about the suffering of the Buddha, the suffering and the anguish of the Buddha. The two are not mutually exclusive, or in the words of the new Stephen Jobs film, suffering and joy do not have to be binary. But let me be quick to say this. I totally agree with the Buddhist perspective that decreasing suffering in the world is an ultimate goal. If it's not the goal, it is a goal of a spiritual journey, to avoid excesses of irrational and unnecessary suffering. We talk about environmental concerns, not because we need to save the planet. We keep hearing people say that. The planet doesn't need to be saved. The planet is not in danger. The planet will survive. What's in question is whether humans will survive. Humans are a danger to themselves. The planet is going to make it. Polluting the planet causes human and animal suffering, and it is the avoidance of that suffering, of that inconvenient reality, that we are motivated by ethics to be concerned about the environment. We are opposed to wars. We're opposed to racism, to discrimination, to poverty, domestic violence, sexual abuse, because all of these are forms of human suffering. So that in that sense, Christians and Buddhists are more or less on the same page. We are against suffering that is meaningless or is brought about by human corruption, or to call it sin. It's not difficult for me to reject the old Roman Catholic way of thinking of redemptive suffering. That is, that Jesus had to suffer for our sins in order to redeem us from the punishment that we so richly deserve. Or maybe I should say you so richly deserve. I don't really feel like I've got it coming to me, but maybe you do. I don't know. But the notion that Jesus had to be nailed up to a cross 2,000 years before you were born, and that he was on the cross saying, I'm tired of this, but I've got to hang on just a little bit more because, well, Ron Snodgrass did something that I should stay up here a little bit longer for. That notion is absolutely absurd. Any contrivance of the Christian religion that begins with the assumption that you're so evil that God had to kill his son doesn't bear critical thinking. It's nonsense. As long as traditional Christianity holds on to this Iron Age mythological way of thinking, it's going to kill what is left of the church. Now I understand why the early church attached themselves to the suffering servant songs in Isaiah. Even as you hear Chris read those words from Isaiah 53, isn't it almost impossible to not hear the orchestra striking up in the background and you begin to hear a full-throated chorus taking up Handel's Messiah? We have associated the suffering servant songs with an understanding of what it means to be Christian. Mark, of course, was very familiar with those suffering servant songs. They were written 500 years before Mark wrote. So he tells the story of Jesus mirroring this concept out of ancient Judah about how the suffering servant brings salvation to the world. But I got to tell you, when the prophet wrote that 500 years before the birth of Jesus, he was not thinking about Jesus. He wasn't thinking about any individual. It was sort of a consolation prize. The Zionist desires of a part of Judah was that they would rule the world. But Isaiah was accepting the reality that Judah is a very small nation and will never rule the world. So his conception of why then are we God's chosen people? What is it that is special about us? And he poetically and beautifully expresses the belief that somehow through Judah's travails, through its suffering, through its repeated imprisonments and conquest, that it was somehow bringing redemption to the world. And Isaiah personified the entire nation as a single individual through whom the world was finding its way. This would be a difficult story to sell in a lot of Sunday school classes in churches around Springfield, because they've been brought up to believe that Isaiah was foretelling the future. But if you can picture, if you're a slave in Babylon and you're living in absolute subservience to your masters, and a preacher stands up and says, don't worry about it. 500 years from now, this guy's going to be born 2,000 miles from here, and he's going to make everything okay. Well, unless you thought you were going to be around 500 years later, that doesn't really do much for you. I mean, there's absolutely no way that Isaiah was foretelling the future. He was describing their existential moment that was full of suffering that he wanted them to see as purposeful suffering. Now, that's hard for a lot of Christians to accept, but trust me, this isn't just Roger Ray. You could read this in any academic journal or resource about the Old Testament. There are no prophecies of the coming of Jesus. Maybe a line or two about a coming Son of Man figure in some of the later prophetic life, but certainly not in Isaiah. But, and I have to say, I'm sorry it took me so long to get to this particular but this but is the but that matters in this particular message. But there is a sense in which suffering can be redemptive. That is, there are times when people have accepted anguish, pain, wounds into their own body, when they have heroically accepted personal risk or even sacrificed their lives in order to save others. Now, that's not saved in some hypothetical go to heaven when you die kind of way, but saved in the more literal sense. And I don't know why Christians get so comfortable with the notion that salvation is always about going to heaven. Even if you look at the most mythologized of the Gospels, in John, when Peter tries to walk on water and he's sinking and he yells, "Lord, save me," he's drowning. He's not talking about save my soul. The most literal sense of salvation is to pull my butt out of the water before I swallow any more seawater. That it is a notion of being saved from imminent suffering. And so there is a concept of redemptive suffering in which people are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to change the context of human suffering. That Sunday morning in March of 1965, 50 years ago, when black activists seeking the right to vote began their march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And the way the Everett Pettus Bridge was built, it had an arch in it, so you march up one side, not able to see the other side. And if you saw the movie Selma, you can feel the power of cresting at the top of that bridge and seeing all of the state police with their dogs and their batons. The rational choice at that point is to turn and run, right? I mean, who among us could have resisted the self-serving desire, the self-preservation to turn and run? But they didn't. and they were beaten. There were people that jumped. There were people that died, if not on that bridge, died as a result of being hunted down and killed in vigilante style afterwards. 2 days later, they were back. They were back, willing to take it again. And because the news media had made the bodies of those beaten unconscious and lying on the pavement well known, the police knew they couldn't do it again. They were willing to suffer on the behalf of their people, stemming the tide of racial oppression. You can easily see how the beatings and imprisonments and the starvation of Mahatma Gandhi, that was redemptive suffering, wasn't it? In the sense that by being willing to suffer in his own body, leading a peaceful, nonviolent protest, that the British colonial rule of India was finally ended. We gained our liberty from Great Britain through a very, very bloody war. They did it through peaceful initiatives in which they did not kill the British, but suffered in their own bodies. Now, during my own adolescence, there were a lot of us who knew that the war in Vietnam was immoral, that it was an unnecessary war, that it was really just sort of a hang-on of colonialism in which a French colony that the French couldn't control anymore, we decided to step in for no good reason whatsoever. A lot of people knew it was morally wrong, but it was the draft protesters going to jail, lead among them, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, that woke up American Catholics and a lot of the rest of us to demand a government change in policy to this neo-colonial warfare. A lot of people were willing to demonstrate and to protest, but the Berrigan brothers were willing to go to prison. They were willing to suffer actual persecution. The Christian reverence for the cross, and the only reason that we have a cross, we bought this building from the Jehovah's Witnesses. There were no crosses in here, but we had a cross made. And I remember standing at the back of the building with Nancy Pate and asking the question, should there be a cross in a church that is basically an interfaith church? And I said, because the cross was a historical event, not for its religious symbolism value, but because it was a historical event, it reflected the willingness to suffer on behalf of the greater good. I argued that it should be here. And there are lots of progressive church growth folks who would say that it shouldn't be here. But because this is a largely middle-class church, we can choose to avoid suffering. It is within our power to choose, basically, to make our lives very comfortable. And so ethically, we are asked at times to choose to suffer for the benefit of others. We don't live in dangerous neighborhoods. Nobody here is going to be drafted. No one here is going to be enslaved. We are not going to be made to run from war as refugees to a foreign nation. Other than having to attend some darned uncomfortable family Thanksgiving dinners, you will not be held captive against your will. Many of the people I talk to say that they just don't read newspapers anymore and they don't watch news on TV because it upsets them. It upsets them, so they don't want to know. They don't want to pollute their souls with that discomfort. In the midst of a sea of indifference, someone who is willing to suffer on behalf of others becomes a shining star, an exception to the rule, a hero, an inspiration. And you know who I'm talking about. Malala Yousafzai was only 12 years old when she started writing a blog for the BBC about what life is like for a girl in Pakistan in a Taliban-controlled area. And she did it under a false name, a pen name. But the New York Times persuaded her to come out from behind that anonymity, to identify herself. And the New York Times did a series of reports on her work and her thinking, advocating for the education of young girls in a very repressed Taliban Muslim-controlled area. And it was this month, just 3 years ago, when a Taliban extremist boarded her school bus, shot her at point blank range 3 times, but only hit her once. I mean, obviously, the tension of the moment, even for an adult with a gun and a still target, only hit her once. But a bullet went through the side of her face and down through her shoulder. She survived the attack, though it has left her appearance somewhat marred. It has affected her speech and general health. But the attempted murder did not change her devotion to seeking education for girls. She was hospitalized for months, but 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, she became the youngest recipient of a Nobel Prize in the history of the world. She has since been invited to visit the White House. And where an invitation to visit the White House is usually, I'm being honored that, you're going to get an ashtray and a brochure or something, that says White House on it, that it is somehow in honor of what you've accomplished. But she took the opportunity to get President Obama alone and school him on how bad the drone policy is. And she was, 14, 15 years old at the time, and she is schooling our president. And if you don't know, let me just say, a lot of these drone strikes are based on what is called technological or broadcast media, that they don't know who's in the house, but they are following cell phones. This whole gathering of metadata, that they say they gather metadata, but they don't personify it, they don't attach it to a person, that's baloney, because that's exactly what they're doing to make the drone strikes targeted. They will know that someone they want to kill has a cell phone in this house. His mother might be using it at that time. But we will send a missile to destroy that house and whoever else is in it. And to avoid talking about civilian casualties, the military policy at this time is anyone we kill, if we killed them, we then, after their death, define them as an enemy combatant, regardless of their age, gender, or what they were doing in the house. So we have no idea how many civilian casualties are actually resulting from these drone strikes. But Malala is sitting with President Obama in the White House and telling him, what you are doing is not fighting terrorism, it is causing terrorism. She is arguably the most famous teenager in the world, and she keeps up a demanding schedule of advocacy for others, even after this failed attempt and all the accolades that she's received around the world, the Taliban have officially announced that it is their intention to kill her and her father. It would not be anything to be ashamed of then if she did what Salman Rushdie did after there was a fatwa declared on him. Grown man, author, he went into hiding. You couldn't find Salman Rushdie for a decade. No one would blame Malala if she went into hiding for the rest of her life. And she could do that in the United States, she could do that in Great Britain, and be safe if only she would shut up. But she won't. She is continuing to raise her voice on behalf of young girls everywhere, knowing that it could cost her her life, already knowing what it is to suffer. I mean, she spent months in intensive care. She already knows that her fear is not irrational. Her fear is real. She knows how bad the world can be, but she is willing to do it on behalf of others. In our country, we don't typically see that kind of institutional misogyny that she's had to face. But we do see millions, hundreds of millions, of people being pushed down and down into poverty with either no employment or poorly compensated employment. We are watching the cost of sending our public school graduates to college go up and up and up, so that education is becoming available to a smaller and smaller percentage of our children. In Malala's case, there is a violent and dangerous threat to keep girls from receiving an education. In the United States, where a college education is as vital to a decent career as a public school education was 30 years ago, we're not doing it at the point of a gun, we're doing it at the point of a paycheck, where we are saying to middle-class people, you really can't afford to educate your children. Your children will have to join the peasant class because they will not be allowed to receive an education. And ultimately, is economic oppression worse than the Taliban's oppression if the end result is the same? We're seeing labor unions undermined in such a way that it's become absolutely rare for workers to even have a pension. That people that are entering the workforce at this point, unless they come from an affluent family, do not have a reasonable expectation of being able to retire at 65 or at 70 or at 75. You've seen it. Don't turn your faces away when you go to a local restaurant and you see someone who clearly should be enjoying her retirement, bringing you your scrambled eggs and toast to your table. I walk at the mall early in the morning and I see people bent over with gnarled arthritic hands, mopping and sweeping the floors of the mall before it opens. These are people who ought to be retired, but they're not. They're still having to work deep into their 70s and some into their 80s in order to eat. 50 years ago, young black men and women were joined with a few white sympathizers, and they paid for access to the voting booth through their own flesh. The Voters' Rights Act was enacted because there were people bleeding and dying in the streets. 50 years later, the Supreme Court was able to gut the Voters' Rights Act with hardly a whimper. It was hardly discussed. The movie Selma was released right as the Supreme Court was saying, we don't need that anymore. And immediately the states that were formerly governed by the Voters' Rights Act began to enact measures to prevent poor, black, and elderly people from voting. The requirement that you have to have a government photo ID to vote. There are fewer than a dozen instances of voter fraud throughout the United States in a year. There are 30 million voters in America who do not have a driver's license because they don't own a car. They're either poor and don't own a car, they live in major urban areas where they use public transit and they don't have it. So they're being told, now you have to go get a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. And right on the back of that, in the state of Alabama, they closed the driver's license offices in 12 counties that were predominantly black populations. So they're saying you have to have this document. They already know they don't have a car. They can't drive to a driver's license office. So they close all the driver's license offices that could be anywhere near them. How can this be happening in what we like to call a democracy? They cut out weekend voting. They require government photo IDs, and to get it in a lot of those states, you've got to produce your birth certificate. How many of you know where your birth certificate is? So if you don't have your birth certificate, you have to go to apply for that. And you know what you've got to have to get a reissued birth certificate? A government photo ID. So that what they're saying is we're going to make it impossible for poor and minority voters to vote. And the church is silent. And the media is silent? Why? Why do we let this happen? Are you afraid someone's going to shoot you in the face like they did Malala? You can challenge capitalism that's run amok in this country, and no one is going to shoot us. Now, some will shame us. Now, this is the interesting thing to me. It could be uncomfortable for you. Some of your Facebook friends might object. With more than half of our local peers being ginned up and angry by the constant flow of misinformation from Fox News and Gannett newspapers, it becomes uncomfortable to actually advocate for justice, to advocate for fair wages, for the dignity of the elderly. I mean, at what point does the obscenity of seeing barely ambulatory elderly people doing minimum wage work, at what point does that obscenity upset us? There are reasons to be angry, folks. Uncomfortable, though, if someone objects. For persons of conscience, though, that willingness to suffer discomfort is necessary. I wish we were made of stronger stuff. I wish that we had more grown-ups with the courage of this child, Malala. If we had a dozen members of Congress who had the character and the courage of Malala Yousafzai, wouldn't we have a different country right now? If there were just a dozen. What I'm asking of you, what I'm imploring of our internet viewers, is to decide that you are going to keep caring, that you will do the work of being informed, that you will use your votes and your voice and your conversations to help fight against poverty and discrimination and the spoiling of the earth, the oppression by the rich and powerful over the poor and the weak. And if you can do that, if you can practice that, if you can grow in your courage by doing little things every day, you may find yourself willing at some point to use your own flesh to bait the trap of evil. Very little progress has ever been made in the absence of leaders who are willing to suffer to change the world.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.